Thank you, Layla. And hello, everyone. Welcome on behalf of the ILCN to today's webinar on community planning and habitat connectivity. We are really excited to be co-hosting this session today with one of the ILCN's key partners, really our partner since our founding 10 years ago, the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. Our focus today will be CLLC's new report, Integrating Wildlife Habitat Connectivity into Local Government Planning. We're going to hear from the two co-authors of the report, Kylie Paul, a road ecologist with the center, and Abigail Brewer, conservation project specialist at CLLC, as well as their colleague Gabriel Oppeler, policy and partnership specialist from the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. Just for awareness's sake, our colleagues are experiencing high winds where they're joining from in Montana, and if they lose power, we may need to adjust the agenda today a bit in real time. So we appreciate your patience with that. So Mac McCarthy, the director of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, often says that in our day-to-day lives in the United States and really in countries around the world, we can sometimes overlook that it is local governments that provide the essential daily services on which we depend. And that includes not just sanitation, roads, public safety, and schools, but also zoning, community development, open space, parks, and other services based in the land that are central to quality of life. And in the United States, as the report calls out, local governments have land use authority over nearly 2/3 of the land across the country. And the federal government has land use authority over about 1/3. So it gives you a sense of the importance of and timeliness of this report. So again, I'm excited that we have a great group of speakers here today who will talk about the work they've led to distill recommendations for local governments on incorporating habitat connectivity into land use planning. And as you listen today, please share your questions at any time in the Q&A box. We'll also monitor the chat if you prefer to put questions in there. And we'll hopefully have a good amount of time at the end for questions after the presentations. So before we dive in, I'll hand it over to my colleague and friend Deb Davidson, Chief Strategy Officer at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, to introduce and share some background on the center. Over to you, Deb.
Thanks, Shawnee. So my name is Deb Davidson. I'm based in Bozeman, Montana, and I have the pleasure to serve on the executive team at CLLC. And for those of you that don't know us, we work across the US and the globe to secure connected and resilient landscapes for healthy communities of people and wildlife. And we are firmly focused on what we see as one of the most pressing conservation challenges of our times, and that's the rapidly increasing habitat fragmentation from human development across the globe. Our team of 25 conservation biologists and policy specialists, 3 of them who are on this screen, work with conservation partners, agencies, and decision makers to expand the practice of connectivity conservation and taking a large landscape approach. That's where Shawnee and I and others at ILCN have done a lot of work to really support this practice. And one of the things that the staff can highlight today too is, scientific studies have confirmed that ensuring connected landscapes is one of our most important and necessary conservation approaches to reduce the impacts of climate change for nature, biodiversity, and I'll emphasize human communities too, and local communities. So we're involved in work across every continent but Antarctica to secure protected, connected landscapes. We actually work with a lot of national governments as well as subnational governments to meet their 30 by 30 commitment of 30% protected and connected lands by 2030. By helping them to base their policies on connectivity science and to make science-based decisions with their policies and laws. This report, I think, comes at a particularly important time in the United States. We all recognize there's an increasing recognition here in the US, Canada, and across the globe that locally led conservation is really the best way forward, and it ensures long-term and durability and true investment from a local community. And I think that's particularly important right now as we see a shift from the federal government in the United States in terms of conservation investments to more state-led and also county and municipality-led efforts. So I'm really thrilled that when we started this report, we didn't quite know the shifts that were going to take place in the United States, but it's very timely. And so we're really excited to share this tool with you and this report. So I will hand it over to my colleagues, and thanks for being here today.
All right, Kylie, I'll hand it over to you to start us off with a presentation about the report, and we're just going to get the slides up in a second.
Can everyone see those slides?
Perfect.
Great. Okay, thanks everyone. Well, I'm Kylie Paul. I indeed am a road ecologist for CLLC and also work a lot on connectivity, and I've got a background working for Missoula County here in Montana. So pretty excited to talk about this issue and connect the dots between wildlife, habitat, connectivity, and local planning. So today we're going to cruise through this issue quickly. So I'm going to cover connectivity overall, what that might mean. Again, a bit on why are we talking about the local government scale. Talk quickly about the report and some of the options for local governments and examples that exist out there. And Abigail will speak to a couple of case studies to get a little more deep in the details. And then Gabe will speak about the international context of this issue. So connectivity, this is a neat slide showing to some aspect of connectivity. It is the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. So it is important, obviously. And indeed, connectivity can be considered the circulatory system of nature. It's a neat way of visualizing it. And landscape connectivity is important, as mentioned previously, with, as Mac had noted, that Shandi had noted, that landscape connectivity is really important also for human health and well-being as it relates to healthy waterways, recreational, scenic, health and happiness improvements, and so on. And maybe if you've heard of this kind of thing, but maybe using different terms, there's all sorts of different terms related to this to some level. Wildlife corridor, movement corridor, wildlife linkage area, migration pathway, greenway, habitat connector. So we're saying about all the same things generally here. And as Deb mentioned, gosh, connectivity is getting less and less connected, as they say. So we've got more people, we've got more roads, railways, power lines, more housing, less undeveloped land, more habitat fragmentation, shrinking pockets of interconnected open space. And so it's an important time. And there is a lot of policy action in the United States. And that's, again, what I'm going to be speaking to for the majority of this portion of my conversation here. A lot happening at a policy level, at federal or state levels. There's been quite a wave of policies and plans recently related to connectivity. It's kind of got a hot topic feel here right now. It's a really important, all-encompassing approach to working on conservation. So that's really important, and having policies for connectivity really should occur at all levels, all scales, across boundaries and jurisdictions. So where does that lead us to? Local government. So as this planner in Minnesota noted, everything trickles down to the local government to implement. Regardless of who makes the law, it's the local government that will implement some part of it. So you need to look at the local government scale if you want to make actual change on the ground. Now, if you're working at other scales, you're also making a really great impact. So don't disregard that part. But the local government role is really important. Indeed, the local governments hold authority potential over nearly 2/3 of the land in the United States. So they can have an enormous decision makers on a day-to-day time period. They can have a really big impact on habitat fragmentation, connectivity, biodiversity, and so on. We do want to note that while local governments, elected officials, planners, etc., have that potential authority, meanwhile, indigenous people and landowners are really, of course, essential to the stewardship of natural resources and wildlife habitat. If there are lacking clear policies or provisions that address ecological concerns, officials, they often lack the tools that they need to guide development in ways that protect these important environmental values. And there's really often a gap between this really important role and the need to protect land and connectivity and so on with what actually happens on the ground. In part, again, because they might not have policies, they might not have capacity, they might not have knowledge, etc., about these topics. So we wrote a report, and this was supported by Pew Charitable Trusts. And this document, we looked around the nation to find examples of local governments that have considered wildlife habitat connectivity and wildlife crossing structures and so on in their plans and policies in some form or another. We wrote it with a range of audiences in mind. So, of course, local planners, local elected officials, partners who may work at a local scale, be it conservation groups or actually state natural resource agencies, other partner groups, anyone who might be interested in that regard, state legislators, etc. So we tried also to look for places around the country to get some representation. Often these thoughts are often thinking about, this only happens in the West, which is where we're based, but we are looking for examples around the nation, and there's some really great ones. I will briefly speak about the layout of the report in case you haven't dove into the very thrilling many pages of it as yet. The introduction, I think, offers a lot of information about the context of the why. Why are we looking at this? So the needs and impacts of connectivity, the role of local governments in engaging in connectivity and thinking about it and working on it in some way or another, the benefits to local governments for doing so, and basically what does connectivity provide local government planning and so on. And an overview of the planning framework, if you're not very familiar with how local governments are kind of set up, which most of us really aren't. There's a lot of ins and outs, and we try to describe them there. And we talk also about how states can drive local connectivity planning. Then we jump into recommendations throughout on many of these, a range of topics and for a range of audiences. And then we really get into the examples and the case studies. And these are, the goal here is to basically offer examples that inspire and that are kind of representative and that then people can link to and learn more. So we give kind of a little bit of information, include sample text from those great examples. And so it's quite a lot of examples that are within there. And so you can kind of pick and choose your own adventure, decide like, I want to look into this, I want to look into this. And then with our case studies, we offer, I think it's 7 or 9, a good number of places that have done a lot of things at once to work on this issue. And then we offer a bunch of resources for anybody to look into more information about these issues. Okay, very basically, here's some best practices. It's just important that local governments aim when they're trying to work on connectivity conservation in some way. It's very important to know where key wildlife habitat exists. If you're trying to avoid developing in those locations, for instance, you have to know where those key areas are. So connectivity mapping, natural resource inventorying, that kind of thing is quite important. Then one should clearly build where appropriate. And doing that, for instance, there's ways of doing so by incentivizing building within town centers rather than stretched out across the rural landscape, and by clustering development. It's, of course, therefore important to protect wildlife habitat and movement by limiting density, development, and activities in those key habitat areas. And to do so, you can secure or expand protected open spaces and have buffers from natural resources. And the way this all kind of functions is basically in the framework that exists out there throughout local governments. And every local government has its own unique makeup of policies and plans and community feel and desires and visions and so on. And so every place is unique. But overall, there are existing these frameworks that we can kind of simplify here. And overall, there's planning that occurs within various plans, and those offer vision and direction. Then there's the policies, which provide sort of the potentially regulatory component of things, and the incentives and the basically the details. The devil's in the details there. And then there's all sorts of enabling conditions. Are basically all the pieces that have helped communities consider and implement connectivity conservation. So science and mapping, funding, land protection, staff that work on these issues, partnerships, regional planning, supportive state roles. I will now dive into briefly a bit each of those things. So comprehensive plans for most counties and towns in the US, they are basically their long-range planning document, and they provide the overall arching vision and direction. They can be known as the master plan, growth policy, general plan, and so on. And again, here we've offered examples of comprehensive plans around the nation that have really great language. For instance, Chaffee County, Colorado, they have within their comprehensive plan protect critical wildlife habitat, connectivity, and migration corridors cross-jurisdictionally. Fabulous. Lake County, Florida, in their comprehensive plan, Lake County shall regulate uses and activities consistent with the conservation element and other policies of this plan in order to protect wildlife, habitat, and wildlife corridors, and so on. So the comprehensive plan sets the vision and the options basically for the rest of it. An element plan is quite similar, but allows more detail and kind of a more resource-based guidance and actions, and they're often incorporated into or amended into the comprehensive plan. So this can be really targeted. You can have like a Teton County, Wyoming has a wildlife crossings master plan. If you've heard perhaps of green infrastructure, that's kind of an approach to connectivity, etc. And Frederick County, Maryland has one of those. So regulations and incentives, these basically, again, implement the objectives of the comprehensive plan. The overall, we can think about it, they can help avoid, minimize, or mitigate. And these this is a catch-all here when I'm describing it here. This all includes the zoning, the codes, ordinances, subdivision, development regulations, standards, and etc. And ways to think about protecting or directing development to areas that you'd like in terms of for connectivity purposes and so on. There's ways to adjust lot size, housing density, the building envelope where a house and a proper can be built on a property. Thinking about fencing, thinking about stream buffers and setbacks. And of course, regulations, very important. They help kind of ensure things get done, and incentives, having a combination is very important as well, and to allow more interest and ability to engage by landowners and so on. And techniques to do so include density bonuses for clustering development, purchasing development rights by communities of landowners and so on. So there's lots of options, and I'm not going to dive into them further, but I will go a tiny bit into one specific example of this because it's very explicit it's an explicit option for perhaps connectivity conservation. So overlay zones are an additional layer on top of base zoning. And that basically means these overlay zones are tailored districts with their own set of regulations and incentives, and they're essentially within a mapped boundary. So if you know of your mapped wildlife corridors or important natural resource areas and so on, then you can have that overlay where certain things can or cannot be done. Some examples, really great ones, Eagle Mountain, Utah has a wildlife corridor overlay. Jericho, Vermont has a natural resources overlay district, and so on. Okay, cruising through. The enabling conditions can be really exciting. Often, there might be a community that you think of and you're like, wow, there's no way we can get really planning involved here, for whatever reason. But there's all sorts of other ways to help move things along towards connectivity conservation in your community. Again, the science and the mapping, that can often be done by partner groups or in partnership with the community to map out, again, wildlife corridors, map out important areas for wildlife and natural resources, etc. Bellingham, Washington, is a city that they did their own wildlife corridor analysis. Funding, of course, clearly essential for literally everything. And for open space acquisition, for instance, there are a lot of communities that have undertaken sales tax that then help to have the community purchase or have conservation easements towards open space. Land, excuse me. Land protection is similar here with my example there. Where acquisition or conservation easements or habitat leasing, etc., can be undertaken to help protect the land that is already open and try to have it be a connected landscape. So Albemarle County in Virginia has got a conservation easements acquisition program that does that. Having staff, some communities have this many staff, which is 0, related to natural resources whatsoever. Some communities have one planner total to do all of the planning whatsoever in their community. So clearly that makes it hard to take on some slightly creative approaches to things. Therefore, it's very important, if possible, to have more staff within a community, within a local government, to be able to do that kind of thing. For instance, Fort Collins, Colorado has a natural areas department, and they have staff working in that. Enabling conditions further. Partnerships are hugely important for this, often either to catalyze or continue momentum or just help with capacity in some way to keep things going. And and here's an example in Northwest Connecticut, in Litchfield County. They have an affordable housing and conservation collaboration, which is quite interesting and quite apropos for many communities at this time. Regional planning, thinking not just of county by county or city by city and thinking, how does all this connect? It makes vastly more sense, of course, to think of it in a regional level. And so if there's that opportunity, that can really help places. So in Arizona, there's a group called an effort, really, the White Tank Mountains Regional Connectivity Initiative. They have done an amazing job at mapping and organizing people and getting things together around Buckeye, Arizona, and elsewhere. So that's a really great example. Further, and finally, on my end, supportive state roles. These can be very important. So states like Maine and New York and Vermont, actually, and North Carolina and so on, they have planning assistance through their basically fish and game agency. And those are folks, they give all sorts of help to planners to consider natural resources in their planning. Some states have incentive programs to help landowners protect land and keep protecting land, keep doing the really great job they're doing, and keep them on the land by doing things like having a property tax incentive for wildlife habitat like they have in Oregon. And North Carolina has funding through, again, their fish and game crowd or their natural resources program, and they offer funding for a county or local government to do planning and natural resources planning. So those kind of things are very useful. So now I would love to skip to Abigail, and I will be her slide changer.
All
So
right,
there
thanks,
she is.
Kylie, and
Yeah.
thanks to you all for your attention. I'm going to dive into a couple of our case studies. I'm going to do one from Southeast US and Florida and one from the Rocky Mountains. So the image that you see is Pasco County, Florida, in West Central Florida, just a little bit north of Tampa. It's got 700,000 people. And the different colors that you see are 8 ecological planning units that represent different ecotypes. So sandhills, forest, coastal marshes, inland river systems. And these came from an assessment of habitat types and wildlife that was carried out in the early 2000s for a variety of species, everything from black bear and spotted turtles, gopher frogs, osprey, fox squirrels, and river otters. And a really fascinating part of this map and story is that this assessment was the result of a citizen-led lawsuit in the 1990s as a result of rapid development. Citizens in the lawsuit alleged that the county was not protecting wildlife in accordance with its comprehensive plan. So that's the overarching vision document that Kylie mentioned that most counties and towns have. There was a settlement in 2000 that required the county to evaluate and protect potential wildlife corridors to connect some of its natural areas. In particular, the natural areas that overlaid with well fields. Well fields in Florida are areas that protect the public drinking water supply, and it evaluated these in light of its ecological interests. About 20% of the county is protected in open space within these planning units. Next slide, please, Kylie. So if we fast forward to 2016, so this is 16 years after the settlement, and really 14 years after that map was put together, Pasco County approved an ecological corridors ordinance to protect the wildlife corridors as the settlement required. So today they have 7 ecological corridors. And these ecological corridors, the large majority of them, about 80% of the corridor land, is already public under some sort of agricultural. And under the ordinance, prior agricultural uses, as well as development approvals, remain in place. So the corridor ordinance only applies if a landowner wishes to rezone their property. So if they want to develop it for greater density or intensity, that's when the corridor ordinance comes into place. In that case, the county can give incentives to a landowner. They can give them greater density or greater lot coverage if they develop in a different area at the edge of their property that we can hope is outside of the corridor. They can relax landscaping standards, any of a number of dispensations. The county can also negotiate with a landowner, with a willing seller, to purchase the property outright or to place a conservation easement. Again, these are all voluntary things that a landowner has to be willing to do. There's a process laid out to determine the sales price, which a landowner can dispute, and they can even dispute their borders being within the corridor if they wish. The funds for this come from a 20-year-old voter-approved sales tax that has a penny on every dollar. It's been disputed twice. It's been extended twice, this sales tax. So it started in 2004, and right now it continues to 2039. This is a pretty powerful tool in this area. It's raised more than $1 billion, and only a portion of the sales tax goes to this ecological lands acquisition program. Other parts of it are used for other interests of the county. One interesting tool that the county has is that new roads are actually prohibited in the corridors that it's laid out. A road is allowed if it's the only option to access a parcel, or if the county, it's part of their vision for developing the road network. But if a road is to be developed, a wildlife crossing is required. Because of the species there, these are usually underpasses in Florida. They could be a bridge or a culvert. So the corridors in Pasco County really support interconnected goals. These ecological planning units, protecting connectivity where they can among them, wetland and riparian conservation, keeping the historic well fields intact, and wildlife movement. So that's one thing that we learned in our case studies, is that Often it's these overlapping of goals that allows them to be successful in different areas. So if I can have the next slide, Kylie. Great, thanks. So now I'm switching to Douglas County, Colorado. Douglas County is just south of the Denver metropolitan area. It's got about 400,000 people in the county itself, but the metropolitan area of Denver has 3 million, so that's really encroaching on it quite quickly from the north. And the county's goal is to address its regional open space interests and ecological connectivity for its residents, as well as for a number of especially large species, elk, mule deer, and bighorn sheep. About 65% of the land in Douglas County is public to begin with. And some of that is this green parallel striped area that you see on your screen. That's National Forest. But this wildlife resources map exists really not to show public versus private ownership, but to show different wildlife value areas. This is part of its comprehensive plan. So the dark green that you see in the middle and a little bit of a U shape, that is its highest value habitat areas. There's the medium green, which is moderate habitat value. A little bit of yellow, especially in the north of this map, which is its low habitat value areas. And then from these, they've also shown in the orange specific movement corridors. They also have the red striped areas, which are designated overland connections. These are places that they have come up along roadways that they intend to keep open, either through crossings that already exist or that they are hoping to put in. A couple of the wildlife crossings that already are there are in the darkest red to the very north of the screen. In addition, you will see there are some green outline boxes. Those are formal habitat conservation areas that exist here in part because of a threatened mouse called the Preble's jumping mouse that have been determined over time. So the policy and regulations for Douglas County are based on this map, which has become increasingly sophisticated over time. If I could have the next slide, Kylie, please. So a fascinating part of Douglas County is that it started off with 65% of its land as public land. Today, 90% of the population lives in its designated urban areas on just 20% of the land. So that's a very interesting thing that they've been able to achieve. They've ended up with the largest open space block in Colorado's Front Range, and this is in an area where development has been going on for quite some time and is continuing. And Douglas County does have many of the same attributes as Pasco County. The map, the voter-approved sales tax that it's using to conserve open space, 26,000 hectares in their case. And a mix of incentives and regulations. But the emphasis has really been different. In Pasco County, it was the lawsuit and the regulations that has gotten to where they have these wildlife movement areas. In Douglas County, the emphasis has really come largely from the vision of the county of conserving wildlife movement, protecting habitat, and then adding the tools that it can do so piece by piece. The planners that we were in touch with there emphasized that their success is based on the vision of the staff and the county, so that they've been able to maximize each of the conservation opportunities that they've been presented, going beyond them. So for instance, they do have their open space funds, which they've been able to match 3 to 1. But even more so, they've also been able to avoid impacts just by looking and saying, is this a place that we can really have development, or how can we work with our developers to steer them to areas where we think this would be better for all of us in the long run? So I think it's important to keep this very human piece of the story for counties that have had success. That's something that Kylie alluded to in one of the last slides about the regional partnerships, citizens groups. It really is connections among individuals that have allowed these counties, which have started on this path 20 and 30 years ago in the case of Pasco and Douglas counties, and then move into where they are today. So those are just the 2 quick examples I'm going to show you from the US, and now we will move on to Gabe and some international perspective on our report.
Great. Thanks, Abigail. And thanks, Kylie. And thanks, of course, to ILCN for having us. Let me share my slides now. Okay, right on. So yeah, my name is Gabe Oppler, and I get to work with Abigail and Kylie in the office at CLLC, but really from the perspective of our international program. So I get to learn and be inspired from all the great work that's happening here within the US. And it was really exciting to read this report to get, a handle on what's going on here at home, and hopefully bring it to some of our partners around the world, and vice versa, be able to learn from some amazing connectivity conservation momentum happening all across the globe. So this first slide, I just threw this in. I just wanted to take like 20 seconds to impress upon everyone on the call how widespread the sort of momentum for corridor planning and connectivity conservation writ large is, just really, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. Kind of represented here by all of the languages that these IUCN global guidelines for connectivity conservation have been translated and taken up into, and just a few of the countries and iconic species and landscapes that have seen national level corridor legislation being adopted. So my role in this short few minutes is really to emphasize that all of the same kinds of ambitions and visions regarding connectivity and corridor implementation are happening on every continent, and a lot of the same challenges, but opportunities for local governments, or generally we say subnational governments, to implement specific actions in service of those corridors exist in, so many other different kinds of ecosystems, landscapes, and legal systems. So I'm going to reference two specific examples of where subnational governments are taking the lead and taking visionary connectivity plans, and really high quality science, and putting them into practice um, within their jurisdictions. One being in Quebec, in Canada, and the other in Ecuador. And I'm actually really excited to see that some of our Quebec colleagues are on the call, because the province has been a world leader in getting into the scaling down and the scaling up of connectivity science and policy and practice. The Quebec Ecological Corridors Initiative, like really a coalition of many of the NGOs in Quebec, has been a main driver of this process. This is their sweet logo. And at the same time, the National Program for Ecological Corridors across Canada is a national model for at scale identifying high priority connectivity areas and allocating real funding and technical capacity to the landscapes to do the fine scale work. So on the left, the national priority areas for connectivity across Canada. Here in the middle, the priority areas for Quebec. And on the right, a fine scale connectivity, or sorry, corridor model that was modeled based on empirical functional connectivity data. So again, we have a lot of sort of potential for implementing specific actions on specific parcels, um, and the science to back up the sort of high priority zoning, or I should say high priority areas here that are in need of more specific attention. So then the question is, what is possible again in the local government remit? And really, the reason I'm highlighting Quebec here is just last year, the provincial government adopted new guidelines for spatial planning for all of the regional counties and municipalities, the MRC in French, that really now require all updated land use plans for each of these jurisdictions to take into account um, connectivity, and specifically by determining and delineating corridors. So this reflects back on some of the overlay examples that Kylie was showing, knowing, as a key principle, knowing where the corridors are and investing in that science as a baseline. One thing that I'm really drawn to, and I see that one of the questions in the chat had to do with regional collaboration and ensuring that one municipality is not doing something in conflict with with their neighbor. The guidelines in Quebec specifically call out the importance of um, coherence in the model in the corridor delineation from one MRC to the next. So, thinking about the overall large landscape, the territory um, as a whole, and yet devolving the agency and the responsibility for governing each of the regions in and of itself. So that's a really um, that's something that's called out specifically in this policy. You're going to see that I'm not going to get hugely into the specifics of what management techniques are being put into place in the corridors, but from the policy standpoint, these guidelines require the government to identify compatible uses, essentially what can or shouldn't be done within the corridor to maintain its connectivity. And there is a specific call out for the creation of wildlife crossing structures, passages, when roads are created or expanded within the territory. And another, shout out to the Quebec Ecological Corridors Initiative for they're developing a toolbox for counties and for municipalities to put into practice this new guidelines from the province. And um, one sort of semi case study that is drawn on for this toolbox um, is some really high fidelity habitat mapping. This is in a Missaquah County, essentially. That this is in their 2022 land use plan, has highly specific um, ecological condition mapping and habitat mapping and regulations within the land use plan for what kinds of protections are especially focused on wetlands and in other like forested terrestrial environments as far as the development of roads or construction of really any kind of development. And so one opportunity now, this is again the 2022 land use plan, is that with the new spatial planning guidelines, uh, each municipality, each county will be required to overlay the corridors that have been developed or are being modeled, and that this habitat mapping will go beyond simply finding where is, say, high quality habitat um, in a generic sense, but be able to specifically say where are the habitat zones that are most conducive for a connected community of wildlife. So that's taking it to another level of specificity and getting us closer to balanced planning. So I'm going to keep moving for the sake of time, and now bring us to Ecuador. And I want to use this example because Ecuador is again become a leader in the connectivity realm ever since 2020 when they adopted legislation at the national level requiring um, the Ministry of Environment to identify corridors between their established protected areas. To date, there have been 6 formally designated corridors, but as you can see on this map, these are really huge, wide, visionary corridors. In other words, it's one thing to put them on the map, and it's another thing to manage them. So, zooming in now to it's a different map, but this is on the eastern end of the Andes in this country. Um, the Sangay Podocarpus corridor, which was the first of these formally designated corridors, um, is yet again this super critical area, but really large scale corridor between 2 national parks. So, getting this space designated was an accomplishment in and of itself. And yet, where the rubber really hits the road, as far as implementing it, comes down to the local level. And apologies for all the text, but the way that governance of the land base in Ecuador is set up, there's really a significant decentralization for land use planning and for really all forms of governance to autonomous governments, provincial, municipal, and district, and so at nested scales. And really, all decisions about zoning and development, permitting, um, are made when their land use plans and development plans are revised every 10 years, I believe. And so the opportunity now, similarly to all the examples we've shown today, are now for municipality to recognize that they're within, in some cases, wholly within this large scale critical corridor, and to take whatever solutions, or sorry, whatever actions they can to prioritize conservation. And so one cool example here from this is a Facebook screenshot, but a municipality that has a significant amount of area in the high elevation Paramo, which is this super, it's like a sponge of water recharge area. It's a high elevation grassland, basically. This municipality has designated as a special water protection zone, um, recognizing that they have the ability within their territory to affect water resources for many other communities downstream, and in so doing, also preserve habitat for jaguar and other really sensitive species. So they're part of that mosaic of this larger corridor. So, so that is where I'm going to leave us. I would love to keep going on various international connectivity developments, but for the sake of time, leave us there, and I will turn it back to Johnny, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabe. That was great. And thank you so much, Kylie, Abigail, and Gabe. It was just a great set of presentations that really highlight first the key findings of the report, the wonderful case studies that are in there, which are really worth digging into further. And then the international resonance of ecological connectivity and how subnational governments can integrate that into land use planning from, Quebec to Ecuador to Sydney and Santiago. So it's really great to see that. So we do have just a bit of time now for questions, and some questions have come through in the Q&A. If you have questions, please feel free to keep typing them in, and we'll try to get to all of them before we close here in just about 10 minutes. So the first question is around waterways. Waterways are a key wildlife corridor, with culverts often acting as barriers across the landscape, some private and others public. What comprehensive methods have you seen to address this type of infrastructure improvement for connectivity, especially through the capital improvement process?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I think Buckeye, Arizona is a really interesting example and also surprise Arizona, which also sort of answers the other question as well. There's this is part of the White Tanks Conservancy that I mentioned here, White Tank Mountains. And those two communities have thought a lot about where are the areas for flooding and waterways and so on that overlap with wildlife corridors, essentially. And so they're trying to think of this as a kind of a green infrastructure approach, where they try to protect those landscapes for multiple purposes. Again, flooding, wildlife movement, actually to some level, like recreational trails and so on. And so I think that's a good example in terms of engagement with local government at this scale. And that can be found in the report in one of our, I believe it's one of our case studies is Buckeye. Yes, it is. So you can find a little bit more there. And Gabe has linked a couple things as well.
Thanks, Kylie. All right, next question that came through. Are there good examples of multiple local governments cooperating on a regional basis to implement connectivity initiatives so that one local government doesn't enact plans or regulations that conflict with an adjacent local government's planning? How often does that conflict arise? And the person who asked the question also noted that they're thinking of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, which might be a good model for regional collaboration. So I think this question is really around local government coordination and what good examples you've seen there, Kylie or Abigail.
Yeah, I think that is another very great question. And part of course, the recommendations we suggest is to ensure that anything is undertaken to address that issue. Because, for example, I can think of in where we live, Montana. I live in Missoula County. It's quite progressive, and nearly all of the surrounding counties are not. And so the likelihood of undertaking some of these efforts are more likely in my county and less around the others. But it's still really important to consider thinking at a regional level, both in that community that might be being a bit more progressive or proactive in this work, thinking beyond the box of their jurisdiction, and trying to encourage their local governments to do so as well. I think it often is a key place here for a state to think and offer these state level approaches, state mapping of connectivity, state laws. Some states have now undertaken laws to push local governments to include connectivity, like California has a great new law in that regard. And so that can push communities, even if they're not as willing to at least consider taking these efforts on. So that's not a super specific example, but again, Buckeye and Surprise in Arizona are adjacent communities, and they've thought ahead and are moving ahead on this issue. So that's, again, one of those examples that you can check out in the report.
Thanks, Kylie. That was a great question. A couple more coming through here. So one is around mapping, and the question is, have there ever been maps created to your knowledge that show recreational trails compared to wildlife trails and corridors? And has there ever been an effort to prioritize closing the trails with the greatest negative wildlife impact? Anybody want to tackle that?
If others have examples.
Yeah, go for it.
I don't know of any offhand. I'm pretty certain, definitely, that has been the case. I know there are, like the state of Colorado has a report that's something about that is linked in our report, that has something like recreation with wildlife in mind or something like that. So it's pushing people at a variety of scales to consider wildlife when doing recreational planning and so on. So offhand, I don't have an example that I can consider, but these are great questions, and I'm tracking them so we can come up with examples to share with folks in the future.
Great. More questions around examples. So Kylie or Abigail, any examples of corridor overlays or defined corridor protection? And if so, what methods have you seen for defining those corridors, whether that's modeling, species observations, generalized multi-species, focal species?
Kylie, I might take this one just really quick, and you guys can then hop in or Gabe. I think it depends upon the scale you're asking about. We've seen some counties. In fact, we're working with Gallatin County here in Montana to do an assessment of connectivity as well as wildlife and transportation issues within the county. So that's one approach, a county-wide, and that's using spatial assessments, geospatial. We have a connectivity team of spatial ecologists, we call them. And there are numerous across the country and increasingly across the globe who are doing that kind of work that use everything from habitat suitability layers. So it might be the type of habitat that exists within a county, for instance, to species observations, collared data in particular. That's kind of ideal if you have it. So for us, we're using some collared elk data, some collared grizzly bear data. And so I think it really depends upon what you're trying to tease out. In the case of, I'll use this county example, we're both trying to help the county and our departments of transportation here determine where should county land use planning be directed in terms of high development versus low development based on key areas for wildlife movement, species observation, and long-term connectivity for the region, and then also for the departments of transportation helping to guide where eventual wildlife crossings would fit in. So I think it really depends. We've also done, 100-mile stretch of roadway wildlife vehicle assessment, which both then gives you sense of land use planning needs, private land protection needs, as well as, of course, the crossing needs on a specific highway. And then there is the ability to do like eco-regional. We just completed a big study for Southern Kenya, Northern Tanzania, which is a corridor atlas that will be really guiding land use planning in that region. That's a huge region. So that's like stepping up a whole level. So I think it depends upon what the needs are. But if you guys want to reach out with any questions specifically around what kind of methodology does exist, we can share that. And I'll put a link in the chat of one place where you can see some of those different examples on our website.
Thanks, Deb. I think we can get to maybe one, or if we're very quick, two more questions. So one question coming through around kind of competing demands for land, increasing talks regarding compatible land use. Do you have any example of comprehensive zoning bylaws that incentivize corridors while permitting some level of human land use or productive land use?
Yes, for sure. I think nearly all of them actually allow, I mean, of the examples that we've considered and seen, basically don't negate private landowners from being able to do activities on their lands if they're within a wildlife corridor. They still do get to do stuff. So this anthropic land use still occurs within those landscapes, but either they're regulated to move, like have any additional new activities be in certain portions of their property, or required or encouraged to, depending, to have like wildlife friendly fencing only, or like Abigail mentioned, you can't build roads unless it's completely required, etc. So the beauty and the curse is that local planning allows for a lot of flexibility. And so that can mean that it's not as hard and fast as, say, conservationists might like to see the protections that we would like to have in those landscapes. But much of this, again, is on private land. And so you can't exactly preclude property rights that are existing. And to keep anyway, so a lot of times there are a lot of things that still are occurring in these places.
Yeah, I would
Thanks, Kylie.
echo that from Kylie as well, just to say that just in about all cases, there still is continued use of the land. It really is, it's the incentive to perhaps develop outside of the designated corridor or to do some type of mitigation associated with your development within the corridor. Rather than making it so that there is a, really what we would think of as a pure ecological connectivity zone, something like that.
I want to mention as well, while time is running low, if anyone has examples that they would like to see that they know of, etc., please reach out to us, send an email, send us the link. We're trying to continuously build on these examples and share out repeatedly over time and to try to develop more of a community talking about this issue more often. So please send our way.
Thanks, Kylie and Abigail. I think we are out of time here. Gabe, did you want to just
I
wrap
was
us up with something? Go ahead.
just going to reiterate the point at the international level, if we have colleagues joining from other countries, from our standpoint here, we're able to get the strongest grasp on actions and policies and initiatives, at the national level and beyond. And it's sometimes harder to know what's going on at that subnational level. And we're really eager, like in our position, to have this exchange of experiences. So if you're joining from somewhere that has county, municipal, provincial, state level connectivity leadership, please do let us know.
Thanks, Gabe. Thanks to this whole panel here, Kylie, Abigail, Gabe, Deb, for joining us today to talk about this report. There is a link to it in the chat. You can access it on the CLLC website and in the ILCN resources page. And as everyone here has shared, please feel free to get in touch with the speakers today to ask questions that you couldn't ask and to reach out for resources or to share examples of your own. We so appreciate your taking the time to join us, and we'll be in touch. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.